Alex Salmond, welcome back to T&G. Good to have you.
Great pleasure.
You're making your first conference speech to your very first Alba Party conference this afternoon. What are you going to tell the new faithful?
Well, it wouldn't quite be my first conference speech, but certainly my first conference speech to Alba. I've done a few of them over the years, so this will be quite a new experience for me, as it is for all Alba members, because it's a new political party. But Alba, it's now got over 6,000 members. We've got 15 councillors as at this morning, when we've got our latest recruit. And we've got 2 parliamentarians. We are probably the fastest growing political party in Europe. But this is going to be the first opportunity for the Alba members to meet each other in a conference setting. So I'll be saying quite a lot to the party, as well as saying a fair amount to the country. And obviously the central Alba message about the urgency of moving to Scottish independence will be the main theme.
Tell me more about that, because this week Nicola Sturgeon made some reference to an independence referendum when she unveiled her programme for the new Scottish Parliament, new Scottish government. She didn't make much of one, though. There was no timings, there was no suggestions of when any of this might happen, just her long repeated promise of in the first half of this Scottish Parliament. Now, you, the Alba Party, have accused her already this week of kicking the can down the road. What did you mean by that? What do you want?
Well, listeners, viewers will remember that old Bill Murray film, Groundhog Day, where the poor man was caught in a time loop, and it took him weeks to get out of it. Unfortunately, Nicola's placed Scotland in a referendum time loop, and it's taken 6 years, and we're making no progress whatsoever. I mean, one of the things I'll be doing this afternoon is I'll be doing a montage of the front page of the only independence supporting newspaper in Scotland, the National. And there's 40 front pages over the last 6 years, taking announcements, not from backbenchers, but from Nicola Sturgeon, her deputy, the president of the SNP, the leader of the Westminster Parliamentary Group, announcing it was game on for the referendum. That the referendum would be this year or next year, it was coming soon, get ready, steady, go, and all the rest of it. So, that's 6 years. Now, the Bill Murray film was a comedy. This is tragedy. This is Groundhog Scotland, Groundhog Referendum, being led up to the top of the hill and then marched back down again. So the Alba message is, look, let's get on with this, and let's stop finding excuses for preparing and giving Scotland what they've now voted for in 5 successive national elections, including this year's Scottish election, where the independence parties not just got a majority of seats, but thanks to the small contribution of Alba, a majority of votes. For goodness sake, let's get on with this. Specifically,
though, what does getting on with this mean? Do you want her to set a date? And if so, when should that date be?
Well, there's several things need to be done. I mean, she announced this week that the civil service are going to start the preparations for an independence white paper. For goodness sake, if we go back to 2011, but we, by 2012, negotiated with David Cameron and George Osborne the timing, the referendum, the question, the fact it would be under Scottish control. And all these people say, what are you going to do when Boris Johnson says no? I mean, listen, if you can face down David Cameron and George Osborne, you can certainly face down Boris Johnson and that disco king, Michael Gove.
Aberdonian disco king.
Well, I mean, these moves were great, but the idea that Johnson and Gove can stop a Scottish referendum when Cameron and Osborne couldn't, I think is nonsense. And what it requires, of course, is political determination to face down Westminster. It requires, the civil service should have been working on the new prospectus for 6 years, but they need to get on with it. It requires a diplomatic, a mobilisation of people, a legal campaign to assert Scotland's right to self-determination and to win our democracy. And above all, the case for independence has to be refurbished for the new world. This is not the world of 2014. This is 2021 and beyond. I mean, most obviously, Britain has now Brexited. Therefore, there's huge work to be done on the European policy, on currency policy, on borders policy, none of which seems to have been done by the SNP. In fact, Alba, in 4 or 5 weeks of the election campaign, made more progress on these issues than the SNP's done for 5 years. Didn't get much chance to get it across, apart from in programmes such as this. But nonetheless, that's the work that has to be done. So it's not just the fact there's no date announced for the referendum. There's no strategy for getting it. And it seems very few preparations have been done to prepare the new case for independence that ought to be presented to the Scottish people.
Well, except the First Minister did announce that she'd instructed civil servants to start preparing a dossier for independence, to try and persuade the Scottish people that it's all thoroughly workable. So she did press a button. And I noticed you didn't actually give me a date yourself either. You accuse her of dragging your feet. You haven't given me a date. You haven't told me when roughly it should be.
Oh, I think you need a referendum as soon as possible. If you take the timescale that was employed in 2012, from getting the assent to Westminster, it took us 18 months to hold the referendum because there's legislation, preparation, a whole range of things to be done. You know, in my view, the Scottish Government should go to the Scottish Parliament with a motion saying we should begin independence negotiations for Westminster now. And now, one aspect of these negotiations might well be a democratic test to establish the Scots' desire for independence. But our starting position should be there's a majority for independence. The people have voted for it. There's a majority of MSPs. There's a majority among the electorate. Therefore, negotiations should start now.
Let me unpack that. Two things you said there. One, you suggest an 18-month time frame. Are you suggesting, therefore, a referendum in October 2022, which will be roughly 18 months since this government got elected? And two, are you saying two referendums? One on whether there should be one?
No, I'm saying that the negotiations, you should start negotiating as we did back in 2011 with Cameron and Osborne. Now, obviously, part of that negotiation was a referendum and what type of referendum it should be, who should control the referendum, who should control the question, who should control the franchise. And sensibly, David Cameron conceded eventually that it should be Scotland, because the idea of Westminster controlling a Scottish referendum, a Scottish self-determination, is self-evidently ludicrous.
To be clear on the date, you are saying it's perfectly legitimate to be able to hold a referendum by October 2022.
Oh yes, I mean that on the sort of time scale that we established last time. You could shorten the time scale for obvious reasons, because there is already a template for a referendum bill that we had back in 2013. And in fact, the Scottish Government, of course, won a vote in the last Scottish Parliament on the concept of how holding a referendum bill. But you know, you've got to stop saying to people, the campaign starts now, without doing A, the planning, B, the strategy, and three, the arguments for making sure you get the referendum and you're able to win it.
Of course, Nicola Sturgeon's counter-argument would be, and I think she made it this week, it would be reckless and indeed possibly counterproductive to push the cause for independence, push a referendum, start pressing a lot of buttons now, while we're still struggling with COVID. North of the border, where you are in Scotland, COVID cases are raging, hospitals are under pressure, and Scottish people may not thank you for distracting attention away from a very important battle against COVID.
Well, I mean, we held a Scottish election in May, a full Scottish general election during the pandemic. I'm not certain what the difference is between having an election and having a referendum, but of course, referendum day is not going to be now in the autumn of 2021. As you said, the soonest timescale you can establish, even if you genuinely fired the starting gun and worked out the strategy for getting Westminster to bend to Scotland's will, the very soonest you could have it now, it would be in a year's time. But, you know, there's been so many reasons for not going ahead and having this referendum. I mean, first, if you remember, it was Brexit. We've got to wait till after Brexit. Well, actually, Brexit was a reason for accelerating the move to independence, not for slowing it down. And similarly, the pandemic, as I say, there's been a Scottish election during the pandemic. There's right. Did you lose me there?
We lost you a tiny bit, but you're back now.
I'll pick up from where it was. I think this is the problem. Is basically this is running out of juice, but hopefully it won't. Let's keep going. Well, there's a Scottish election during the pandemic. So, I mean, why on earth wouldn't you be able to at least plan to have a Scottish referendum? I mean, there's always going to be voices in Scotland because some people are just opposed to the idea of Scottish self-determination. There's going to be lots of voices in Westminster. But equally, there's a majority for going ahead with allowing Scotland to determine its own future. And it's the majority wish that should be respected.
Well, one voice might be the voice of the Scottish people. Let me say it again. Well, one voice, Alex, might be the voice of the Scottish people. There was a big opinion poll, did it last week, and they found that just 31% of Scottish voters want a referendum, would support a referendum in the next 2 years.
Well, opinion polls show a variety of things in a variety of ways. I mean, what's best in democratic politics is to accept the result of elections. And the mandate for having a referendum of Scottish independence was as clear as any mandate can be. That is a majority of seats in a proportional system and a majority of votes for parties supporting independence. Now, you can't get clearer than that. I mean, that's far, far clearer than the mandate that David Cameron, for example, claimed to have a Brexit referendum. Far, far clearer than that. And clearly that desire is going to have to be satisfied at some point. Now, I think, and Alba thinks it should be sooner rather than later. It's not as if we've been waiting for this for 6 days. This is a process, as I point out, that's now been going on for 6 years. And that seems to me long enough.
All right. What about the pragmatic point of view from fellow supporters of independence who might also tell you that if you held a referendum now, or even indeed in the next 6 months, a year, you could well lose it? That opinion poll I mentioned came out last week was the first one in 6 months to find a positive rating for independence. It was just 51% versus 49% against. And all the polls in the last 6 months have put the cause for the independents in the minority. So why not wait? Why not wait until you can build a little bit more support? This is, after all, your second once-in-a-generation chance. After all, you won't get another after this.
And I remember the 22 polls before that all showed majorities for independence. Look, the best you can say about opinion polls, and I was questioning Sir John Curtis in these matters quite recently, and who would argue with that? The best thing you can say about opinion polls on independence is 50-50. It's eaksy-peaksy, it's level pegging. Now,
well, that's a gamble. That's a gamble. Why do you want to spin the wheel on 50-50?
Okay, well, the point I would make is when the first referendum, starting gun, was fired in 2012, then support for Scottish independence was 29%. And during the campaign, because we were articulating the case for independence with a defined timescale for testing it, that support ended up at 45% at one point in the campaign, and famously, as you may remember, it got over 50%. The point is that a substantial amount of the independent support was garnished during the campaign, because unless you articulate the cause of independence, you prepare to argue the arguments and state the reasons for it, then you're not going to convert more people to your cause. And it's very difficult to do that if independence is an afterthought, something you say in a programme because there's an SNP virtual conference coming up, but not something that's first and foremost. I mean, for me and for Alba, independence is for the here and now, not for the hereafter.
Let me put another of these opinion poll ratings to you, one which you'll be familiar with, and that's on the economy. I would put it to you that your greatest deficit in terms of support for independence is on the economy. And this poll found that 40% think independence would damage the Scottish economy, rather than 35% who think it would benefit. And 36% think independence would make them financially worse off, compared to 18% who think it would make them better off. And there's a lot of don't knows in that as well. How would you go about repairing that economic deficit? Or, crucially, Alex, would you be prepared to accept that actually there might be a bit of an economic hit to begin with? That's what the Brexiteers said. They were quite open about that, but it would be worth it in the long run. Well,
Tony, you answered your own, sorry, say it again. Well, Tom, you answered your own question. The number of don't knows, and even that opinion poll. Obviously, people don't know because the case for the economics of independence isn't being articulated. Now, let me give you an example. Things that have changed since the referendum of 2014. And huge things have changed that have to be addressed, for example, the whole European question. But on the economy, back in 2014, let's say 10 years ago, offshore wind energy was something you had to subsidise. It's important because Scotland has an estimated 1/4 of the entire offshore wind resource of Europe, not of the United Kingdom, but of Europe. But offshore wind 10 years ago was something you had to subsidise. Now, of course, as we know, it's amazingly lucrative. The billions of profits are being piled up in the offshore wind. The Scottish licensing rounds are just getting underway. Are we going to have a situation where, rather like oil in 1970, we have this amazing resource exploited in Scottish waters, and there is no share of these profits, of that magnitude of wealth for the Scottish people? Or are we going to do, a la Norwegians back in 1970, make sure that every single offshore wind energy projects has a share for the Scottish people through a Scottish National Renewables Corporation. Now, that's the sort of big economic decision, and the magnitude of the resource we're talking about is amazing. The sums we're talking about are mind-boggling, 50, 60 billion pounds of investment. But the decisions on where that benefit is going to flow, these are going to be made very soon. And it's exactly the sort of economic argument you'd want to introduce into an independence campaign. But outside Alba, I see very little sign of that happening at the present moment. Perhaps our conference will stir up more interest in these matters, particularly with the approach of the huge climate conference in Glasgow.
Let me put this to you, Alex. There are some who might hear you this morning and say, oh, that's just Alex Salmond. I know what he's up to. He's executing his grudge against Nicola again. There's nothing he likes more than sticking it to Nicola Sturgeon because of what he thinks she did to her during her whole criminal trial. Is that true?
Not in the slightest. I mean, I've spent 50 years articulating the cause of Scottish independence. I want to make sure that Scotland gets the opportunity to vote ourselves there, but before I hang up my political boots, I've got no interest in personalities other than what's best for independence. I think Alba has two roles, actually. I mean, a long time ago, you remember, Tom, I devised this project whereby the SNP could, in the long term, replace the Labour Party as the dominant party of Scotland if it put forward sensible left of centre policies. I also knew that in the meantime, as we were working to that project, which turned out pretty well, but in the meantime, every time the SNP won a by-election, all of a sudden the Labour Party would start talking about self-government again. Well, as it was for the SNP and the Labour Party back in the 1990s, so it is now for Alba and the SNP. If Alba make a breakthrough, any level of breakthrough at the Scottish local elections next year, all of a sudden, excuse me, if Alba make a breakthrough, any sort of breakthrough at the Scottish local elections last year, if Alba make a breakthrough, any sort of breakthrough at the Scottish local elections next year, then all of a sudden, it'd be like there's an SNP conference every week. The SNP leadership's enthusiasm for independence would be magnified 10 times over. So all I'm interested in is advancing the cause of Scottish independence, and in particular now advancing the timescale by when the Scottish people will get a new opportunity to vote themselves to freedom.
All right, you're giving Nicola a kindly helping hand, that much I understand. To prove this isn't a grudge match, to prove this isn't just you versus her again, say something nice about her. What's good about Nicola Sturgeon and her government?
I think Nicola Sturgeon is one of the best communicators in recent politics, not just in Scotland, but anywhere. And I mean, the pandemic is a really good example. You mentioned earlier, the Scottish figures of the pandemic are dreadful at the present moment, absolutely dreadful. In policy terms, there's been very little difference between the handling of the pandemic north and south of the border. But
you're supposed to be saying something nice, Alex. Be careful. You started well there.
No, I'm about to say it. But in communication terms, the response to Nicola Sturgeon has been infinitely better than the response to Boris Johnson. Nicola Sturgeon is one of the best communicators of a political message that politics have experienced, and therefore all the more reason that we should have these communication skills deployed in the cause of Scotland in an early Scottish referendum.
Beautifully brought round to your main message. You haven't lost your touch. Alex Salmond, the leader of the Alba Party, thanks so much for joining us on TNG this morning.
A great pleasure. Thank you.